Hello and welcome back. It is genuinely good to have you here, wherever here is for you tonight. I want you to picture something. It is late, 11 o'clock perhaps, on a winter evening somewhere in England in the year 1814. The fires burn down to a low amber glow and the rest of the house is quiet. At a writing desk near the window, a man is sitting with a letter in his hands. He has read it several times already. It is from his wife, who is visiting her mother in the next county, and it is entirely ordinary. She mentions the weather, a cold that has been troubling her, a book she's been reading, a particular shade of ribbon she saw in a shop window and could not stop thinking about. And yet he is still sitting with it, in the low light, not rushing to answer it, just sitting. Here is the thing that might genuinely surprise you. We think we know what Regency husbands thought of their wives. We have watched enough period dramas and read enough Austen to feel fairly confident about the shape of it. Either the brooding intensity of a man like Mr. Darcy, or the pompous obliviousness of a man like Mr. Collins, or the quiet, bloodless cruelty of men who treated marriage like a property transaction, and their wives like a particularly well-dressed piece of furniture. We think we know, but the letters survived, the diaries survived, and what they show, what the actual private writing of actual Regency men reveals, when you sit with it long enough, is something far more complicated, far more human, and in many ways far more surprising than either the romance or the horror. Not monsters, and not heroes, people. Ordinary, conflicted, often bewildered people, navigating a system they had inherited and never thought to question, and feeling things inside that system that the system gave them almost no language to express. Tonight, that is exactly where we are headed, into the private world of what Regency husbands really thought, what they felt, what they feared, and what they sometimes quietly, in ink, in the small hours actually said. If this kind of storytelling helps your evening settle into something slower and richer, it would mean a great deal if you hit subscribe and left a like on your way in, and drop a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? In bed with the lights already off? On the sofa with something warm? I genuinely love knowing where these stories find you. Now, dim whatever lights you can. Let the room go a little quieter around you. Let your shoulders drop. We're going back to the drawing rooms and dining tables and very private writing desks of Regency England, to the men who loved, worried over, depended on, occasionally misunderstood completely, and sometimes, in the particular honesty that only comes out after midnight, genuinely cherished the women they had married. Let us begin. It is 1813. You are a man of reasonable means, a younger son of a country gentleman perhaps, or a solicitor with promising prospects and a small but respectable income, and you're about to do the most consequential thing you will ever do in your life. Not the most dramatic, not the most dangerous, the most consequential. You're getting married. The negotiation has been going on for 6 weeks. Your family's solicitor and her family's solicitor have been corresponding about settlement terms with an attention to detail that would be more appropriate for a treaty between small nations. There is the question of her pin money, the annual allowance she will receive as her own, entirely separate from household expenses to spend as she chooses, on what she chooses, without having to ask anyone's permission. For a woman of her family's standing, this will be somewhere between £200 and £500 per year. Both families will argue about the exact figure with a seriousness you find slightly puzzling, given that you're going to be her husband, and you fully intend to give her everything she needs. You don't quite understand yet why the pin money matters so much to her family. You will, eventually. What you do not fully grasp, what almost no one has sat you down and explained plainly in actual words, is that the moment you exchange your vows, your wife will legally cease to exist as a separate person under English law. This is not a metaphor. It is a legal doctrine called coverture, and it has governed English marriage for centuries. Under coverture, a woman's legal identity is absorbed entirely into her husband's upon marriage. She becomes, in the eyes of the law, a femme covert, a covered woman, sheltered beneath his legal personhood, which is another way of saying she disappears into it. She cannot sign a contract. She cannot own property. Any money she inherits, any goods that belong to her, become yours the moment the ring is on her finger. She cannot keep her own wages if she works. She cannot sue in court under her own name. If she writes a letter that becomes relevant in a legal matter, that letter belongs to you. She belongs, in the eyes of the law, to you. And you, preparing for your wedding in the autumn of 1813, almost certainly have not sat down and carefully thought through what this means. It has not occurred to you to think about it. This is the water you swim in. It is simply how things are, how they have always been, how your father's marriage was arranged, and his father's before that. The structure of it sits inside you, like furniture sits in a room you have lived in since childhood. You don't see it anymore, because you have never known a room that was arranged differently. This is the first and most important thing to understand about what Regency men thought of their wives. Most of them thought within a system they had never chosen and never examined. A system that gave them complete legal authority over another adult human being, and that they had inherited, not devised. The private diaries of the period are not full of men congratulating themselves on their power. They are full of men who appear barely aware they have it. That unawareness is its own kind of cruelty, of course, but it is a different cruelty from the one we tend to imagine. It is not contempt. It is something more like incuriosity, the incuriosity of someone who has never been asked to look at the walls of the room they live in. The word husband carries a trace of something older and more complicated than we usually notice. It comes from the Old Norse husbondi, the house dweller, the man bound to the house, the one responsible for its stewardship. Not owner, exactly, but custodian, the one who tends. By the time of the Regency, the law had pressed these two ideas, tender steward and absolute legal controller, into the same person, the same marriage, the same bed. The tension between those two things is what the private writing of Regency men is really about. When you look closely enough, before the wedding, in the months of courtship, those carefully supervised afternoons in drawing rooms, those managed conversations at assemblies and concerts, men wrote about the women they were considering with a mixture of qualities that might genuinely surprise you. Appearance was noted, but it was rarely the primary preoccupation in the diaries of men who wrote thoughtfully, and the Regency produced a remarkable number of men who wrote thoughtfully. What appears again and again in these private pages is temperament, steadiness, good sense, warmth, what the period called simply good humour, not funniness, but an even, resilient, pleasant disposition that would make a house livable and a long life endurable. These were not unromantic men, but their romanticism was practical in a way that becomes entirely sensible once you understand what they were actually choosing. They were not choosing a companion for Saturday evenings. They were choosing the person who would manage their household, raise their children, negotiate with their cook, supervise the linen accounts, receive their friends, navigate the social world on their behalf, and be the quiet, emotional centre of every room they came home to, for the rest of their natural lives. When a Regency man wrote in his diary that Miss Such-and-Such struck him as a woman of excellent good sense, he was paying her one of the highest compliments available to him. He was saying, in the language of the period, "I think I can build a life with this person. I think this will hold." He had typically spent perhaps 15 to 20 hours in her company, all of it chaperoned, all of it in public rooms, in public clothes, performing the elaborate and mutual pretense that courtship required of both of them. He didn't know whether she cried when she was frightened, or laughed too loudly when she was nervous, or went very quiet when she felt overlooked. He did not know what she thought about money, or about faith, or whether she was a morning person, or an evening person, or the kind of person who was neither and needed an hour of silence before she could speak sensibly to anyone. He knew what she was like at a piano recital and at a dinner table, and from 15 hours of supervised public performance, he had decided that he wanted to marry her. The settlement, when it was finally signed, contained within it a quiet acknowledgement of something that neither family discussed openly, that the woman being given in marriage needed a degree of protection from the marriage itself, not from her future husband personally. In most cases, no one suspected anything so dramatic as that, but from the structure of what marriage was legally in England in 1813. Her family solicitor had argued for the pin money not because they believed their future son-in-law to be ungenerous, but because they understood, in a way that he might not yet, that a woman with no money of her own is a woman who must ask permission for everything she spends. A woman who must ask for everything is a woman who must remain perpetually grateful for whatever she receives. The pin money was small in the grand scale of things, but it was hers. It existed outside the arithmetic of the marriage. It was legally the one area, the only area, where the system had not entirely swallowed her. Her husband, in most cases, would not think of it this way. To him, it was simply a line in the settlement document, one clause among many. What strikes historians who have spent time reading the correspondence surrounding Regency marriage negotiations is how differently the same document was understood by each party. The husband saw a contract organizing a shared future. The wife's family saw a contract negotiating around a legal system that had made their daughter, in a technical and deeply consequential sense, a dependent. Same words, same signatures, read through entirely different eyes. Here's the myth that needs dismantling, and it is a subtle one, because it runs in both directions. We tend to imagine Regency marriage as something women entered under duress, trading liberty for financial security, and sometimes it was. But the evidence from private mail correspondence is considerably more complicated than that. Men too were anxious in the months before a wedding, more anxious than the era's stiff exterior permits them to appear in retrospect. Diaries from the weeks before Regency weddings record worry about money, about whether the house was adequately prepared, about whether her family approved of him, about whether he was going to be in any meaningful sense a good husband. The anxiety is specific and ordinary. It does not read like the confidence of a man who believes he's acquiring property. It reads like someone who knows he's about to do something important and is not entirely certain he is equal to it. There is something in that I find quietly worth dwelling on. The morning after the wedding, after the ceremony and the dinner and the carriage and everything that followed, narrated in period accounts with varying degrees of tactful omission, you wake up in a house that is now shared. The fire has been lit by a servant who came and went before you were conscious. The room holds the smell of beeswax and something faintly floral. Her things arranged on the dressing table across the room, unfamiliar objects occupying familiar space. And she is there, not as a prospect, not as a name on a settlement document, not as the woman you conversed with for 20 minutes at the Hartley's dinner in April, as a person, fully present, about to come down to breakfast with you. You are, in that moment, strangers sharing a house that the law has already decided you both inhabit. What happened next, in those first weeks, in the slow process of discovering who you had actually married, is where the private diaries of the period become extraordinary reading. Because here is what they consistently show, these men who were suddenly sharing their daily lives with someone they barely knew at all. They were surprised, not unhappily in most cases, genuinely, repeatedly, and occasionally in ways that border on the quietly comic surprised. A man who had assumed, based on their chaperoned afternoons, that his wife would be pleasant and undemanding, discovered she had precise opinions about estate management and was infuriatingly usually right about them. A man who'd expected calm found warmth so immediate and direct that it was almost disorienting. A man who had noted in his courtship diary that she seemed sensible found, within the first months of shared life, that she was sharp, quietly, occasionally uncomfortably sharp, in ways that no assembly or dinner party had given him any way of detecting. The Regency archive contains, when you read across it, an extraordinary number of husbands writing some version of the same thought in different words, that they had not known before marriage what they were getting, that they knew now, that it was considerably more than they had anticipated, which is either a genuinely charming thing to discover about the person you married, or a fairly pointed observation about the structural absurdity of chaperoned courtship as a method for selecting a lifelong companion. In all likelihood, as with most things from this period, it is both. The household keys arrived on the second day, not in any formal ceremony, but with the quiet weight of one. The keys to the still room, the linen cupboard, the wine cellar, the larder, the dairy, if the establishment ran to one, passed from the housekeeper's custody into the new mistress of the house. Heavy, literal, iron objects, and what they represented was something the law had not extinguished: complete authority over the domestic interior, the food, the drink, the laundry schedules, the preservation of everything in its season, the order of things. This was her domain as absolutely as the estate's income and management were his. The law had absorbed her legal identity, but it had handed her the keys to the house he lived in. The arrangement was neither prison nor sanctuary. Most of the time, on most afternoons, it was quietly both. What most Regency husbands appear to have discovered within the first year of marriage is that their wives were managing something of considerably greater complexity than they had ever thought to notice. The household accounts that have survived from this period are remarkable documents. Detailed, methodical, organised records of every expenditure, from the annual coal delivery down to the cost of the thread used to mend a single tablecloth. These were not kept by husbands. In house after house, across family after family, the records are in the wife's hand, precise, annotated, often marked with small observations about where economies had been found, what suppliers had proven reliable, what experiments had not paid off. The men of the Regency were not ignorant of this, but many of them seemed to have understood the scale of it only when they saw it close up, in the actual daily texture of a shared life. Several private letters from the early months of Regency marriages contain what reads, in the formal language of the period, like genuinely surprised respect, a husband writing to a friend and mentioning that his wife has handled some domestic or social complexity with a capability he had not predicted, and describing it with admiration that is entirely sincere and only very slightly sheepish. Only very slightly, because to admit great surprise would be to admit how little he had expected, and what he had expected, and what he found, and the slow negotiation of two people becoming something that runs alongside each other. That is exactly where we are headed next. Because the first year of a Regency marriage, it turns out, was not what either party had imagined, and the thing neither of them had imagined most clearly was each other. The breakfast table was the first real test of it. Not the wedding night, despite what the novels imply, not the ceremony itself, with its formal solemnity and the watching eyes of two assembled families. The breakfast table, the morning after in ordinary light with no occasion to give the moment any particular weight, was where the first year of a Regency marriage actually began. You sat down across from someone, there was toast, there was tea, there was the steady sound of a clock, and you were both, simultaneously, performing the role of a married person for the very first time, with no rehearsal and no chaperone and no script. Most Regency accounts of early marriage, in diaries, in letters to close friends, in the oblique references of novels so clearly drawn from life, circle around this moment without quite naming it. The adjustment, the novelty, the particular low-grade awkwardness of sharing daily life with someone whose daily habits you have never once observed. He discovered that she preferred silence in the mornings and could not be spoken to about anything consequential before the second cup of tea. She discovered that he read at the table, which her mother had always told her was a sign of bad character, but which she found in practice somewhat restful. Small negotiations, mostly unspoken, the kind that constitute the actual architecture of a shared life, built one quiet morning at a time. The two worlds of a Regency marriage were, in almost every household, kept deliberately separate. His day and her day ran parallel, intersecting at mealtimes and in the evening hours, but largely distinct in ways that went beyond mere custom. If they were a country family, he had the estate, the tenants, and the accounts, and the unending correspondence that land ownership required. If they were in London for the season, he had his club, his political circle, his professional and social world, a whole landscape of rooms and conversations that she could not enter. She had the house, the household, the children when they came, the staff, the menus, the social calendar, the visiting and receiving that was the currency of their shared position. What strikes you, reading the private correspondence of Regency husbands, is how little many of them actually knew about what filled their wives' days, not always through indifference, though indifference played its part, but because the two spheres were so genuinely and completely separate that a man could pass weeks without witnessing in any direct way what his wife's daily life actually contained. He knew she managed the house. He did not usually know what managing the house required, hour by hour in the actual grain of it. He knew she received callers on Tuesday afternoons. He did not always know what those calls involved, what social intelligence was gathered, what alliances quietly maintained, what crucial small negotiations conducted over tea and pound cake in the front parlour, while he was nowhere near the building. Several husbands, writing after extended periods of travel or after a wife's illness, had forced them briefly to see the household from a different angle, describe a version of the same quiet reckoning, a dawning awareness that the smooth running of everything they had taken for granted was being held in place by a continuous and entirely invisible labour they had never paused to calculate. The fire lit before they came downstairs. The meals that appeared without their having once thought about where the provisions had come from, who had been told to obtain them, or what the cook had been instructed to do with them, the social engagements managed on their behalf, the letters answered, the visiting cards correctly returned within the socially mandatory 48 hours. None of it happened by itself. All of it happened because someone arranged for it to happen, and that someone was not him. Think about that. Not the unfairness of it, though the unfairness is real enough, but the sheer structural invisibility. A woman could be competent, creative, economically precise, socially skilled, and capable of managing a complex household with the quiet efficiency of a general managing a campaign, and all of it could be entirely invisible to the man who slept in the same house and ate at the same table. Not because he was cruel, because the organization of their lives had been designed so that her excellence operated just slightly outside his line of sight. Sir Walter Scott provides a particularly illuminating example of this pattern, not because he was unusual, but because his letters survived in such quantity and have been so carefully studied. Scott was, by most accounts, a genuinely warm and devoted husband. He wrote to his wife Charlotte frequently when he was travelling. He worried about her health in his letters with an anxiety that was entirely real. He expressed, in dozens of letters over decades of marriage, a dependence on her that was not performance. He needed her. He said so. He meant it. And yet, reading those same letters, you become aware of a persistent gap. He writes about Charlotte as though she is the centre of his domestic world, while somehow managing to say almost nothing about what that domestic world actually contained day to day. He loved her. He also, in some fundamental way, had never quite looked at her. The two things coexisted without apparently striking him as contradictory, which, as a portrait of a marriage, is either deeply poignant or gently absurd. Most likely it is both. This is not a story unique to Scott. It is the dominant pattern of the period's private correspondence, warmth and obliviousness, sitting comfortably together at the same breakfast table for 30 years. What sometimes changed this? What produced in the archive a different quality of letter, a different register of attention, was proximity forced by crisis, a long illness, an extended period where he was housebound and she was unavoidably visible in her actual work, or simply the slow weight of years, which did something to some men that nothing else quite managed. Several husbands in middle age wrote about their wives with a specificity that their younger selves had never managed, noting particular qualities, particular habits of mind, with the kind of detail that only comes from years of actual observation. The early diary had admired her good sense in the abstract. The middle-aged letter admired the precise way she handled a particular kind of difficulty, the specific thing she had said in a situation that had resolved what he could not. He had been surprised by her at 25. He was still being surprised, quietly, at 45, just more particular about it. In other marriages, many other marriages, the parallel lives stayed parallel. They were civil to each other, warm in a general way. They raised children together, managed money together, appeared at the correct social occasions together, and behaved correctly at all of them. From the outside, the marriage was a good one, and the husband wrote almost nothing in his diary about his wife, not because he disliked her, but because he felt, nothing that particularly demanded saying. She was simply there, present and reliable and essential, in the same way that the fire was always lit before he came downstairs. He had no vocabulary for what her presence actually meant to him. that vocabulary would not arrive until much later, and sometimes it would only arrive when she was gone. There is one more piece of the picture we need to look at before we go further, and it is the piece that most people miss entirely when they think about this period. We've talked about what Regency husbands expected before marriage. We've talked about what they found in those first years. But there is a third thing. What the era told them they were supposed to feel. What the conduct books said. What the sermons said. What the poetry said. Because the pressure of the Regency period on its married men was not, as we sometimes imagine, a simple pressure to be dominant and unconcerned. It was something considerably stranger than that. And it shaped everything. The Regency period published an extraordinary number of books telling people how to feel. This is perhaps the most revealing thing about the era's cultural life. The sheer volume of printed guidance on the correct emotional conduct of everyday existence. There were books for women on how to be a wife. There were books for men on how to be a husband. There were books on friendship, on grief, on the appropriate reception of bad news, on the correct expression of religious feeling in a domestic setting. The conduct book was the era's defining literary form, which tells you something useful about the era itself. It was a period of intense social performance, and a period in which people apparently needed a great deal of assistance knowing what, exactly, they were supposed to be performing. The ideal wife, as described in the conduct literature of the period, was cheerful, quiet, and economical. Not brilliant, not challenging, not particularly curious. Cheerful, quiet, and economical, the three qualities of a well-managed kitchen fire, which is either coincidence or a fairly pointed metaphor. The conduct books for men, meanwhile, describe the ideal husband as firm, benevolent, and rational, the steady captain of a small domestic vessel, responsible for its direction, without needing to concern himself with what was happening below decks. What neither set of books mentioned, because neither was designed to mention it, was the emotional reality of sharing a breakfast table with another human being every morning for the rest of your life, and what that actually does to a person. The phrase domestic happiness appears in Regency period writing with a frequency that would be remarkable in any other era. It is in the sermons, domestic happiness as the foundation of a properly moral nation. It is in the poetry, domestic happiness as the highest form of human contentment available to ordinary people. It is in political speeches, a stable home, a contented wife, and a husband of good domestic character as the ideal building blocks of a properly ordered English society. The phrase carried the full moral weight of the era's self-image. It had become, in effect, a national aspiration, and like most national aspirations, it placed the practical burden of its achievement primarily on the people who had least power to define what it meant. The pressure on Regency husbands to perform domestic happiness was real, and it was considerable. A man whose household was visibly troubled, whose wife appeared openly unhappy, whose domestic life carried any detectable quality of disorder or coldness, that man was understood to have failed at something fundamental, not just at marriage, at his role as a properly constituted English gentleman. The household was, in the symbolic language of the era, a direct reflection of the man who governed it. A disordered household implied a disordered character. This meant that many Regency husbands suppressed conflict, not because they were indifferent or cruel, but because visible conflict was itself a kind of public confession of inadequacy. The mask of domestic happiness was, for many of them, not cynicism. It was the form that respectability took. Now here is the detail I find genuinely worth pausing over. The conduct and etiquette literature of the period devoted more column inches, more careful, considered, specific instruction to the question of how a husband should handle a disagreement over household expenditure than to any other single topic of marital life. Not infidelity, not grief, not the management of children in a crisis, household expenditure, the exact decorum required of a husband who believed his wife had spent too much on coal this quarter, or had authorized a repair he considered unnecessary, or had ordered new curtains for the morning room without first discussing the matter with him. Page after careful page in guide after guide across the entire period, which tells you something important about where the actual friction of Regency marriage is tended to live, not in operatic romantic tragedy, but in the small daily negotiations over who controlled how the household money moved. Quiet, persistent, entirely ordinary, and apparently requiring more printed guidance than almost anything else. The myth we tend to hold about this period is that Regency marriage operated at extremes, either the grande passion or the cold arrangement, either Mr. Darcy or a loveless transaction. The reality for most ordinary households was considerably more prosaic than either. It was two people disagreeing, politely and within the correct social forms, about whether the housekeeping accounts were a little high this month. It was a husband who thought they were, and a wife who knew, from daily experience, exactly why they were what they were, and was not especially inclined to explain herself to someone who'd never once engaged with the supplier, negotiated a delivery, or attempted to feed a household of 10 through a cold November on a fixed quarterly allowance. Small disagreements, ordinary ones, accumulated over years into either a foundation of mutual understanding or a set of quiet parallel trenches. What many Regency husbands expected from marriage, shaped by the conduct books, by the cultural ideal of domestic happiness, by the example of their parents' households and the formal social world they'd grown up in, was a kind of warm, smooth efficiency, a house that ran correctly, a wife who was pleasant and steady, a domestic life that moved forward with the quiet, well-ordered progress of a properly governed estate. What they found, in most cases, was something more complicated than that, and something, it should be said, considerably more interesting. They found a person, a specific one whose intelligence had been deliberately limited by an education designed not to develop it fully, and who had consequently turned whatever intellectual capacity she possessed toward the domains actually available to her, and who had become, in those domains, quietly formidable in ways that courtship had given him no way of detecting. Women's education in the Regency period was, by design, narrow. Languages, a little music, some drawing, basic arithmetic. Nothing that might produce a woman who was too independent, too analytical, or too likely to form strong views about things outside the domestic sphere. And yet the consistent testimony of private male correspondence is that their wives were sharper than this educational system intended, sharper than the conduct books had implied they would be, sharper, sometimes, than felt entirely anticipated. Several husbands, writing in the months after their weddings, noted their wives' opinions on estate or financial questions with a sheepish admiration that is consistent enough across different letters to constitute a pattern. The phrasing varies, but the structure is almost always the same. I had not anticipated that she would have a clear view on this. She has a very clear view on this. She was right. Similarly, multiple accounts describe a wife who had seen through a social or domestic problem immediately, stated her solution briefly, and proved to be correct, while her husband had been circling the same problem for considerably longer without arriving anywhere useful. He had not known she had opinions about such things. She had not previously volunteered them. Whether she had been waiting to see if he would arrive at the answer on his own, or simply waiting to be asked. The letters do not say. He does not seem to have asked. The fire would be low by then, in the telling of these letters. The house already quiet. The hour late. And the man at the desk writing, in the slightly dazed language of someone who has just discovered something that was there all along, that his wife is a good deal more than he had understood her to be. What happened in the marriages where this discovery deepened, where the surprise of who she was settled over years into genuine partnership, is the warmest chapter of this story, and it is where we are going next. Because some of these men, the private writing suggests, found something inside their marriages that the heir had no precise word for, not the conduct book ideal of domestic happiness, something more particular, something that had been quietly earned. There is a particular kind of letter that appears again and again in the private correspondence of Regency-era men. It is not a love letter exactly. Love letters were a recognized form, and they had a recognized shape. And this is not quite that. It is something less formal than a love letter, and more honest. It is a letter written on the road, or from lodgings in London, or from a friend's country house during a visit that has stretched a day longer than intended. It is addressed to a wife, and it contains, somewhere inside it, beneath the road conditions and the quality of the dinner and the news about someone they both know, a line or two that breaks the surface of the era's formal language and says, in terms that are almost startlingly direct, "I miss you. I'm finding it strange to be without you. The house I am in tonight is perfectly comfortable, and it is not the house I want to be in." These letters exist in considerable numbers. Many of them have never been published, residing in county archives and private collections, and the uncatalogued papers of houses that no longer belong to the families who built them. Some have been published in collections of private correspondence and studied by historians of the period, who have noticed, as a consistent pattern, that the emotional temperature of Regency private correspondence tends to run considerably warmer than the public culture of the era would lead you to expect. The mask presented to the world, formal, measured, emotionally contained, and the face behind it, in the private letters, were often quite different. What did these men actually write about their wives when no one else was reading? They wrote about missing them at meals. Several letters note, with a specificity that is oddly touching, that dinner in a particular inn or at a particular friend's table was perfectly adequate, and that the conversation was good, and that he ate well, and that it was not what he wanted, and he could not entirely account for why. He could account for why. He simply couldn't say so in terms that would have felt appropriate. They wrote about worry, not the grand, theatrical worry of a man who believes his wife to be fragile, but the low, constant, particular worry of someone who is deeply aware that the person he depends on is out of his sight and could, at any moment, need something he cannot provide because he is not there. Many letters that begin with mundane travel news become, 2 paragraphs in, a request for reassurance. How is she feeling? Has the cough improved? Did the doctor come when he said he would? The worry has a texture to it. It is not performed. It occupies real space in the letter. They wrote in several cases about what she had said before he left. A particular remark, a piece of advice about the journey, a quiet observation about a family member that had turned out to be exactly right. The detail is what makes these passages interesting. He's not praising her in general terms. He's remembering a specific thing she said on a specific morning and finding that it has stayed with him. That staying with quality, the way a particular sentence from a particular person lodges in the mind and keeps returning, is one of the more reliable markers of a close and genuine attachment. You do not remember in that particular way what acquaintances say to you. The pin money letters deserve a mention of their own. These are short notes, often just a few lines, left by a husband with a small gift or a sum of money, sometimes on a particular occasion, sometimes with no occasion at all. They have survived in surprising quantities, tucked into the pages of account books and inside the covers of small journals, preserved in the way that people preserve small things that matter to them without quite knowing why. The notes are often funny, dry, affectionate in a key that feels modern, somehow, the kind of warmth that doesn't announce itself, the kind that assumes the recipient will understand and trusts her to. There is no performance in them. They were not written for anyone to see, which is, of course, precisely why they tell you something true. William Wilberforce, the reformer and abolitionist, whose private correspondence has been studied in some depth, wrote about his wife Barbara with a mixture of tenderness and complete bewilderment that is enormously endearing once you spend time with it. He loved her, without question. He also found her throughout their marriage rather difficult to fully understand, not because she was complicated, but because he was not, in the domestic sphere, a particularly observant man. His letters to her and about her show someone who was deeply attached and genuinely uncertain, in equal measure, about how to navigate the particular domestic reality that he'd committed himself to. He wrote about her frequently to close friends, always warmly, always with that distinctive texture of a man who knows the value of what he has and is not entirely sure he deserves it. What you notice, reading across the private correspondence of Regency-era husbands, is the letters that were clearly written in the habit of writing to each other. Not the letters of early marriage, when every letter still has a quality of novelty to it, but the letters of the middle years, when the correspondence has become part of the structure of a shared life. These letters are shorter, more compressed. They assume a huge amount of shared context. They reference, in passing, things that clearly belong to an ongoing private conversation, something she had said last week, something they had both noticed at a dinner, a running domestic comedy about something in the household that has been a running domestic comedy for years. The shared private language of people who've been living alongside each other for a long time. That particular language, the compression of it, the shorthand, is one of the things that cannot be performed. It can only be accumulated slowly from actual daily life. These letters are the evidence of something that the Regency's public culture had no particular framework for celebrating. A marriage that had become, quietly and over time, a genuine and specific friendship between two people. Not a romance exactly. Romance is a different thing, with a different arc. A friendship. The specific kind that is built from years of shared meals and shared worries and shared running jokes about the coal bill, and that produces eventually a quality of company that is irreplaceable because it is irreplaceable. There is no one else who knows what she knows, who has seen what she has seen, who carries what she carries, specifically and only because she is who she is, and has lived the life that she has lived. Some of these men knew by middle age what they had. The letters from men in their 40s and 50s to wives about wives in the weeks following a wife's illness or absence have a different quality from the early years, more precise, more specific, more aware, in a way that younger letters are not, of what it would mean to lose it. The next time you find yourself reading a Regency-era letter and encountering a passage that seems unexpectedly direct in its feeling, that seems to break the surface of the era's formality and say something honest, that is what you are reading. A man who has worked out late what he should have noticed sooner. Not all of them worked it out. Some of them never had occasion to. The parallel lives stayed parallel, and the marriage was adequate, and neither party wrote much about it, and that was that. But for those who did, and there were more of them than the era's reputation would suggest, the private writing tells a story that is not the story we tend to tell about this period. It is quieter than the fiction, less dramatic, more ordinary, and somehow, because of that, considerably more moving. The shadow side of all of this, what happened in the marriages where the discovery of each other produced not warmth, but something colder and harder to navigate, is where we need to go next. Because not every marriage found its way to that particular quality of earned companionship. Some of them simply found their way to silence, and the silence, in the archive, has its own particular eloquence. The first thing to know about unhappy Regency marriages is that the law had made almost no provision for them. Divorce, real divorce, the kind that legally dissolved a marriage and permitted both parties to remarry, required a private act of Parliament. Not a trip to a solicitor, not a petition to a judge, an act of Parliament, which meant a public debate in the House of Lords, the airing of the relevant grievances before a body of the nation's most senior men, and a level of social exposure that was catastrophic for almost everyone involved and financially ruinous for those who attempted it. Across the entire Regency period, there were fewer than 5 parliamentary divorces per year in England, fewer than 5 in a country of millions of married people. The message this sent was not subtle. Whatever was happening inside your marriage, the institution had no meaningful exit. What most unhappy couples did instead was separate, informally by mutual agreement, with whatever financial arrangement the two families could negotiate between them. The husband might retire permanently to his country estate while she remained in London, or she might go to live with a family member, or they might continue to share a house in the technical sense while conducting entirely separate lives within it. These arrangements carried social stigma, more for her than for him, as almost everything did. But they were more common than the historical record tends to suggest, because they were designed not to appear in the historical record at all. They were by mutual necessity private. The silence in men's diaries about unhappy marriages is, in its own way, one of the most telling features of the entire archive, where happy marriages generated letters, the frequent, warm, specific letters of men who were writing to people they missed. Unhappy marriages generated gaps, extended stretches of diary with almost no mention of the wife at all, or mention so brief and formal that they read less like a record of a marriage and more like a notation that a particular piece of household furniture had been moved. She attended the dinner, she's in good health, she has gone to her mother's. The sentences have a quality of performed adequacy. They are technically true. They say nothing. This is not a single case. It is a consistent pattern. Read enough Regency-era male diaries and you begin to develop an instinct for the difference between a man who writes little about his wife because there is nothing pressing to say, and a man who writes little about his wife because to say more would be to say something he cannot bring himself to write down. The former tend to mention her in passing, casually, as part of the furniture of a life that is generally going reasonably well. The latter tend not to mention her at all, and the not mentioning has a quality of effort to it, a shape, the shape of something being avoided. What some men did, when their marriages had grown into something painful, was leave. Not in the emotional sense, though sometimes that too, but physically. Extended absences became a recognized social mechanism for managing a domestic situation that had ceased to be manageable. A man with a seat in Parliament could be in London for 8 months of the year with complete legitimacy. A man with military connections could take a posting. A man with a state business could ride the same circuit of tenants and suppliers for weeks at a stretch. His wife, meanwhile, ran the household in his absence. Several private accounts describe women managing the entire daily operation of a family property with considerable competence, making decisions, dealing with staff and suppliers, handling local social obligations for months at a time, while their husbands were absent in ways that had, at the very least, a practical convenience to them. What is striking about the letters these absent husbands sent home, in the unhappy marriages when they sent any, is how different they are from the letters of the contented ones, where the contented husband's letter was specific and warm, and mentioned her name in the middle of sentences rather than only at the beginning and end. The unhappy husband's letter tends to be correct and brief, and organized entirely around logistics, the children, the estate, whether the particular repair has been attended to, whether she requires any additional funds for the quarter. It is the correspondence of two people managing a shared enterprise that neither party is especially glad to be part of, conducted with all the correct courtesies and none of the warmth. You could not call it unkind. You could not call it much else. There was a term that appears in social accounts of the period, not in official documents, but in diaries and letters, in the language that people used privately to describe what they observed around them. The term was affectionate estrangement. It described couples who maintained toward each other a tone of warmth and civility, while having, between them, no real intimacy of any kind. They were kind to each other in public. They spoke of each other with appropriate regard. They appeared at the correct social occasions and behaved with correct marital decorum, and behind all of that there was nothing particularly happening, no ongoing conversation, no shared reference, no running domestic comedy. Just two people in adjacent rooms, conducting their lives in parallel with a surface of good manners stretched between them like a sheet over furniture in a closed-up house. Affectionate estrangement was not considered a failure in the vocabulary of the period. It was considered a respectable outcome. It was, in a society that offered almost no mechanism for escape and considerable social penalty for visible unhappiness, something close to an achievement. You had managed your domestic situation. You had maintained the form. The household ran correctly and the social obligations were met and nothing embarrassing had happened. If there was a gap at the centre of it, where the particular quality of earned companionship might have been, that gap was not visible to anyone who was not sitting inside the house, in the quiet hour after dinner, listening to the clock. The men who wrote nothing about their wives in those years were not in most cases writing nothing because they had nothing to say. They were writing nothing because the thing they had to say was the thing the era had given them no language for and no permission to express, that the arrangement they were inside was not what they had wanted, and that they did not know how to want anything different, and that this particular shape of loneliness, surrounded by people in a correctly functioning house, was perhaps the strangest and most private thing about being a Regency husband, But there was one thing, one specific, particular thing, that stripped all of this away. That made the formality impossible, the silence unnavigable, the mask simply too heavy to hold. Not the good years, and not the difficult years. The moment when a man, whatever the quality of his marriage had been until that point, was forced to understand what it would mean to lose her entirely. And that moment, in the Regency period, came with a terrible and specific regularity. It came at childbirth. Childbirth killed women. This is not a dramatic flourish. It is simply what happened, with a regularity that the Regency period understood in its bones, even as it spoke about it in the most circumspect possible terms. The statistical risk per individual birth, approximately 1 maternal death for every 100 deliveries, does not sound in isolation like an overwhelming figure. But consider it across the arc of a marriage. A gentry-class woman in the Regency period would have, on average, between 4 and 8 children. Some had considerably more. The cumulative risk, across multiple pregnancies, across multiple recoveries, across the compounded physical toll of repeated childbirth, in an era without sterile technique and without any reliable treatment for the infections that followed. That risk was something every husband who could do arithmetic had, somewhere in him, calculated. He had almost certainly lost a mother or an aunt or a neighbour's wife or a close friend's wife to childbed fever. He knew what it looked like. He knew what it cost. And when his wife entered confinement, the formal withdrawal of the final weeks before delivery, when she retreated from social life into the care of other women, he knew, in a part of himself he almost certainly never expressed aloud, what the next several weeks might bring. The word confinement deserves more attention than it usually receives. It describes, literally, a woman confined to the house, to her rooms, to her bed, attended by a midwife and a monthly nurse and whatever female relatives could be present, while her husband occupied a strange and almost entirely powerless position, present in the house, excluded from the room, without any meaningful agency over the most consequential thing that was happening under his own roof. His role during his wife's confinement was to wait, to manage the estate correspondence, to receive the daily reports passed out through the door, to eat his meals alone or with whatever company happened to be in the house, and to try to sleep, and to go on waiting. What men wrote in their diaries during their wives' confinements is one of the most consistently revealing categories of Regency private correspondence. Men who had written almost nothing about their wives for months, the parallel lives marriages, the affectionate estrangements, the men whose diaries mentioned her presence in a single brief line, sometimes suddenly wrote pages. The anxiety broke through the formal language in ways the formal language had not been designed to accommodate. Several diaries from this period describe men who could not sleep during the long nights of a difficult labour, who walked the house at hours when they should not have been awake, who found themselves outside a closed door, unable to account for what was happening on the other side of it, and unable to make themselves go further away. The worry that had been invisible in the ordinary months, managed, suppressed, unrecorded, became, during confinement, impossible to hide from the page. This pattern is consistent enough to suggest something important. Many Regency men were carrying a level of anxiety about their wives' safety that they had no socially permitted way to express in ordinary life, and confinement simply removed the suppression mechanism. The diary became the place where the mask came off. Not deliberately, not as an act of chosen emotional disclosure, but because at 2 a.m, in a house that was very quiet and very not quiet at the same time, a man wrote what was true. And then sometimes she did not come through it. The writing that follows a wife's death is the strangest and in many ways the most significant category in the entire Regency mail archive. It is strange because it is so completely different from everything that preceded it. Men who had maintained for years a diary of composed domestic notation, the estate, the weather, the social calendar, the brief mentions of a wife who was simply there, suddenly found, in the weeks after her death, a voice they had not previously used. Raw, specific, unguarded in a way that nothing else in their writing had been. The formal language that had contained everything for decades seemed, in grief, to simply stop working. And what came out instead was something else. What they wrote about was not grand philosophical reflection. They wrote about the particular things, the chair she had always sat in, on the left side of the fireplace, which they could not bring themselves to move. The hour of the afternoon that had been hers, that now had no particular shape. The sound of the household in the morning, subtly wrong in a way they could not precisely name, except that it was wrong and had been wrong from the moment she was gone. Several widowers' diaries from this period record with careful specificity small habits of hers that had never once appeared in years of previous entries, things observed, never commented on, things that had been completely invisible while they were happening and had become, in their absence, unbearably precise. The gap between what he had felt and what he had recorded, between the private man and the diary man, the years of brief mentions and logistics and performed adequacy, turned out, in grief, to have been considerable. Let that sit for a moment. The question of remarriage adds one more layer of complexity to this picture, and it deserves to be addressed honestly because it is frequently misread. Widowers in the Regency period often remarried within 12 months of a wife's death, sometimes within 6. This is regularly interpreted by readers approaching the period from outside as evidence of a coldness that confirms every suspicion about how little these men had actually cared. The reality is considerably more complicated. A widower with young children had no one to manage the household and no one to care for those children in any consistent way. The estate required a mistress. The social calendar required a hostess. The children required, in the specific domestic vocabulary of the period, a mother. The practical pressure to remarry was immediate, came from multiple directions simultaneously, and was entirely real. It was also, in several cases that have left a written record, genuinely agonizing. Private letters from Regency widowers in the months before a second marriage make clear, in some cases, that the decision was not made without considerable cost. The grief was real. The pragmatism was also real. The two things existed simultaneously in a way that the era's emotional vocabulary had no proper accommodation for. A man still in grief, not yet recovered, who would perhaps not fully recover for years, and who was nonetheless standing in a church again within the calendar year because the structure available to him, legally and domestically and socially, gave him almost no other option. What the archive shows, and this may be the most quietly surprising thing in all of it, is the grave visits. Men who remarried within months of a first wife's death, and who continued, for the rest of their lives, to visit her grave with a regularity that went well beyond any social obligation. Men who had said almost nothing about her while she lived, and who said nothing in public about their grief afterward, but who appeared at the same churchyard, in the same quiet way, season after season, for decades, some of them until the very end of their own lives, not performing, not observed, simply going. There is something in that I keep coming back to, long after other details of this period have settled into the background, the gap between what was expressed and what was felt, between the formal language and the thing the formal language was arranged to stand in front of, between the man who sat in the drawing room and discussed the estate and the man who, on a quiet morning in November, walked to a churchyard and stood at a stone that had her name on it. These were always the same man. The era had simply arranged things so that you very rarely saw them both at once. What all of this leaves behind, what we carry forward, what we misremember, and what we lose entirely when we try to understand this period through the frame of period fiction, is where we need to go now. Because there is a final thing to say about what Regency men thought of their wives. And it is the thing that in the end matters most. Jane Austen never married. This is not an incidental biographical detail. It is, for our purposes tonight, one of the most important facts about the Regency period and how we understand it. Because the lens through which the modern world most often approaches the era, the language, the social architecture, the emotional grammar, the shape of what a man and a woman in that period were supposed to want from each other, is almost entirely filtered through the work of a woman who observed marriage from the outside with extraordinary intelligence and considerable irony, but who never lived inside one. Austen's men are brilliant constructions. Darcy, Bingley, Colonel Brandon, Mr. Knightley, Captain Wentworth. They are among the most precisely observed portraits of masculine behaviour in the English literary tradition, and they are portraits, social observation from a specific angle, shaped by a specific kind of attention, the attention of someone who watches very carefully and thinks very clearly and is not, herself, inside the institution she's describing. This is not a criticism. It is a distinction. And it matters because when we reach for the Regency period, we almost always reach for Austen first. We read the era through her eyes, and her eyes, brilliant as they were looking at it from a particular position. The diaries and letters tell a different story. Not a better story necessarily, not a more romantic one, but a more particular one. One in which the men are not characters, with their one central attribute and their emotional arc resolved over 200 pages, but people. Complicated, contradictory, often inconsistent people, shaped by a legal system that gave them complete authority, and a social system that gave them almost no emotional vocabulary, navigating their marriages with whatever tools they had, which were generally inadequate, and feeling things they could rarely say, which were generally more than the era's public image of them would suggest. The Regency has been romanticised by the 21st century in ways that would probably have surprised the people who actually lived it. What we've retained from the period is its aesthetic, the dresses, the ballrooms, the wit, the restraint, the particular way that longing was communicated through a glance across a room. And what we have largely set aside is its texture, the daily reality of it, the cold mornings, the anxiety of confinement, the household accounts kept in a wife's patient handwriting, the letters written from inn-rooms at 11 at night, the churchyard visits, quiet and repeated, that no one was meant to see. What the actual archive of Regency marriage tells us is not the story we tend to tell. It is quieter, less dramatic, more ordinary in almost every respect, and because of that ordinarity, considerably more human. Here is what I think we miss most when we look at this period from outside, the ordinariness of the feeling itself, the things that Regency husbands felt about their wives, the worry, the pride, the dependence, the quiet tenderness, the helplessness during confinement, the specific grief that followed loss, are not remote from us. They are not the feelings of another species. They are entirely recognizable. You know what it feels like to miss someone at a meal. You know what it feels like to notice too late something that was there all along. You know the shape of being grateful for a person's presence in a way you have not quite found words for. These feelings did not change between 1813 and now. The system that surrounded them changed. The legal framework changed. The social permission to express them changed. The feelings themselves are continuous. This is the thing that the archive keeps offering if you sit with it long enough. Not the distance of 200 years, but the surprising nearness of it. The recognition. The sense that the man at the desk in 1814, reading his wife's letter for the third time in the low firelight, is not entirely a stranger. The women historians who have spent the most time with this material have noted something that tends to get lost in broader accounts of the period, that Regency wives, despite the legal erasure of coverture, despite the formal subordination, despite the pin money and the household keys and the parallel lives, exercise considerably more real influence over the shape of their marriages and of their households and of their family's social world than the law on paper would lead anyone to expect. The influence was informal. It operated in the register of daily life, not in legal documents. It was the influence of being the person everyone in the house actually listened to, the person whose opinion the husband sought without formally acknowledging that he was seeking it, the person whose management of the household and the social world and the children quietly determined the quality of the life that both of them were living, invisible in the record, completely present in the house. The most striking thing about the Regency marriage archive, read in its entirety, is not the cruelty. It is not the romance either. It is the ordinariness. Two people building a life, constrained by law and by custom and by a social system that had given them specific and limiting roles, finding, inside those constraints, their own particular shape, some of them finding warmth, some of them finding silence, some of them finding something that the era had no precise name for, and that we might not have a much better name for now. That quality of accumulated shared life that becomes eventually so specific to two people that it cannot be replicated or replaced, only mourned when it is gone. The system was different, the feelings were not. And that, I think, is where we should let the evening rest, in that recognition, in that nearness across the centuries, in the understanding that the people in these letters and these diaries were not performing history. They were simply living, trying to love each other, or trying to, in the only world they had. Let us stay with that for a little while. The fire has burned low. You're in the room where you began, or the room where you always were, in fact, because there was never really a room in the past. There was always only this one, the one you're in now, in whatever arrangement of pillows and blankets and dim light constitutes your particular corner of the evening. But the fire that was burning in 1814 in the room of the man at the writing desk has a correspondence with this one. Not the same fire, the same principle, the same pull toward warmth at the end of the day when the rest of the world has gone quiet and the only thing left to do is let the thoughts settle. The man at the desk folded the letter eventually, set it carefully to one side. He would answer it in the morning, he told himself, when the words came more easily. Or he would answer it tonight if the candle held. He sat with it a little longer in the orange light, in the quiet house, listening to the particular sound of a building that has been lived in for long enough to settle into its own rhythms, the creak of the floor above, the knock of the window in its frame, the soft voice of the fire doing nothing in particular. She had written about a ribbon she'd seen in a shop window, a particular shade. She could not stop thinking about it. He read that part again. Outside, the night was deep and still, the kind of stillness that belongs to winter evenings in houses that are far enough from other houses to have their own silence. The candle was lower now than it had been when he sat down. He should go to bed. He knew he should go to bed. Instead, he dipped the quill one more time and wrote the beginning of something. Not an answer, exactly. More a reaching toward. And then stopped, because the words he wanted were not quite the ones he had available, and he was tired, and the fire was low, and she would be home on Thursday. Thursday was close enough. He put the quill down at last and sat for another moment in the fading light, the letter on the desk in front of him, and thought about nothing in particular. This is a thing that happens in the quiet houses of history that we do not often think to record. The pauses, the unwritten moments between the sentences, the time that passes in rooms while the candle burns and nobody is doing anything of historical significance, which is most of the time he was just sitting, in a room that smelled of tallow and a little of wood smoke and whatever was beginning in the distant kitchen for tomorrow's breakfast. Just sitting in it, the way people sit in the last hour of the day when the day has finally let them go. You know this feeling, not the specific room, and not the specific year, and perhaps not the specific person waiting for you in another county, but the feeling itself, the late evening settling, the moment when the mind stops pushing forward and simply rests in wherever it happens to be. This is not a feeling that belongs to any particular century. It is older than the Regency period and considerably more persistent. The house around him was settling into its nighttime self. Houses do this. They have a different quality in the small hours than they have at 3 in the afternoon, something to do with the way sound moves differently when the rooms are still and the fire is low, and the people inside are gradually leaving wakefulness for wherever sleep takes them. A creak in the ceiling above, the faint sound of wind at the window's edge, the kitchen fire going about its slow, banked work somewhere below. She would be home on Thursday. He had said this to himself several times already, and each time it had the same quality of small, practical comfort. Not poetry, and not declaration, simply the particular reassurance of a known thing at a known time. She would be home, the house would return to its proper weight, the mornings would have their shape again. This is not an especially romantic thought, but most of the thoughts that sustain a person across the long and ordinary stretch of a shared life are not especially romantic thoughts. They are precise and small and reliable, and that, it turns out, is precisely what makes them sustaining. The settlement that had been signed in a solicitor's office 6 weeks before the wedding had included a clause about pin money, £250 a year, her own, to spend on whatever she chose. He had thought at the time it was a detail of no particular consequence. He understood it differently now, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because he had lived inside the reality of what that money meant for long enough to see it clearly. The difference between a woman who had a small resource of her own and a woman who had none. The difference between asking and not asking. The difference between a person and a dependent. He was glad her family's solicitor had been so quietly insistent about it. He had not known enough at the time to be insistent himself. The keys were in her keeping. They had been since the second day of their marriage, and the transfer had happened without ceremony. The housekeeper had simply passed them to the new mistress at an appropriate moment, and that had been that. But what they represented, which he had come to understand only gradually, was a kind of authority that the law had not thought to extinguish when it extinguished everything else. She unlocked things. She decided what was kept in the locked rooms and how it was managed and when it was used. The still room with its ordered rows of preserved things, the linen cupboard smelling of dried lavender stacked in a system entirely her own that she could locate anything within in 30 seconds. The wine cellar, accounted for quarterly in a ledger she kept in her own neat hand. He had never looked at the ledger. He trusted her judgment in these things entirely, and had never, in quite so many words, told her so. That, he thought, was something he might do. On Thursday, the fire had dropped to a single amber line at the base of the grate, the only warmth left in the room now that the candle had shortened itself toward its end. He could ring for a servant to attend to it. He did not. There was something appropriate about sitting in the diminishing light in a house that would be full again in 3 days, letting the evening go at its own pace. The darkness was not uncomfortable. It was simply honest, the room showing itself as it was without the performance of light. He thought about the letters. Not this particular letter, but the whole accumulation of them. Years of correspondence, folded and tied and kept in a box in the study that both of them had contributed to without having discussed it. She kept his. He kept hers. This had simply happened. The way that certain things between two people happen without being decided, because the instinct to preserve is older than the decision to, and some things are worth keeping, and so you keep them. Most of the letters were entirely ordinary. Road conditions, the weather, a note to say he had arrived and would be home by Thursday. But some of them were something else. The something else was in the minority, and it appeared in no particular pattern, not always in the letters written during significant moments, but sometimes in letters written during moments that had seemed, at the time, entirely unremarkable. He was not a man given to sentiment, which is to say he was a man who felt things that he did not often express, which is a slightly different thing, and a more ordinary one than either description suggests. Outside, frost was making itself known at the window glass, the faint crystalline work of cold arriving in the small hours. Tomorrow morning, the kitchen garden would be white. The paths would be hard underfoot. The sky before dawn would be that particular shade, not quite black and not quite grey, that belongs to winter mornings in England, when the air has a quality of held breath, as though the day has not quite committed to beginning. She would be home on Thursday. The roads would be passable. The house would return to its full and correct weight. He thought about what it would sound like, the carriage in the drive, the particular quality of the hall when it is receiving someone, the sound of the door. These are small things to organize a feeling around, but feelings, it turns out, do not require grand occasions. They arrange themselves around whatever is available, around a particular shade of ribbon, seen in a shop window and mentioned in a letter, around the left side of the fireplace, around the way a morning sounds when the right person is in the house. The candle guttered once steadily, and then continued its slow work. There is something that the archive of this period keeps returning to, underneath all the legal language and the formal correspondence and the careful social surfaces, the simple, irreducible fact of presence, the fact of being in the same house as a particular person over many years, and what that accumulates into. It does not have a grand name. It does not appear in the conduct books or the sermons or the poetry written to celebrate domestic happiness. It is too ordinary for any of that. It is simply what time does to two people who share enough of it. It becomes the specific texture of their world. It becomes, gradually and without announcement, the thing they would not know how to be without. The man at the desk would not have known how to say this. The era had not given him language adequate to it. But he knew it, sitting in the last of the warmth, in the last of the light, with her letter in front of him, and 3 days until Thursday. He knew it in the way that you know things you do not have words for, in the body, in the particular quality of a room's silence, in the low amber of a fire that has done its work for the day and is resting now, and will be attended to in the morning, and lit again, and attended to again, and lit again, in the long, ordinary, irreplaceable continuity of a house that is lived in by people who have chosen to live in it together. Let us rest here for a little while, in this room, in this light. There is no need to move. The evening has gone soft around the edges, the way evenings do when they are ready to become night. The thinking can slow now. The questions can wait. You have been here long enough to know the shape of what was true about these people, the ordinary shape of it, the human shape of it, the shape that connects their world to yours across 200 years of everything that has changed and everything that has not. The fire breathes, the frost works quietly at the glass, the house settles into itself. Think about the breakfast table, not any specific one, and not any specific morning, but the general idea of it, the recurring ritual of 2 people sitting down together at the beginning of a day, with tea and whatever the kitchen had managed, and the slow, quiet business of beginning. In the Regency period, as in almost every period before and after it, the breakfast table was where the shape of a marriage became visible in miniature, whether they spoke easily or with effort, whether the silence between them was comfortable or strained, whether one of them read at the table and whether the other found this a problem or had stopped noticing it years ago. These are not dramatic things. They are the ordinary texture of shared life, which is also to say they are the most important things, the things that determine, over the course of years, what a marriage actually feels like from the inside. He read at the table. She had not found it a problem in the end, or she had decided not to, or she had decided to find it, in its own way, somewhat restful, the companionable presence of a person who is absorbed in something and therefore not requiring anything from you in the first 20 minutes of the morning, which is its own kind of consideration. Small accommodations, unspoken ones, the kind that accumulate so gradually you forget they were ever decisions at all and simply become the way things are. The kitchen would be warm already, somewhere below him. The kitchen was always warm before the rest of the house was awake. This was another thing that simply happened, that had always happened, that he had never thought to trace back to its origin, which was the cook's understanding of what was expected, and the cook's understanding of what was expected had come from the mistress of the house, and the mistress of the house had established it in the first weeks of their marriage, and had maintained it for all the years since. And he had come downstairs every morning of those years to a house that was already warm and never thought to wonder why. He was thinking about this now at the desk in the late hour, in a way that he would not have been thinking about it 6 years ago. Something in the accumulation of time was making certain previously invisible things visible. He was not certain whether this was wisdom, or simply the change that came from paying slightly more attention than he had in his 20s. Perhaps it was both. He had been a reasonably attentive young man. He had also been a young man who believed that attentiveness was the same as understanding, which it is not, and which no one tells you in time to do anything about. Outside, the wind had shifted slightly, a change in the quality of the sound it made at the window, and the frost would be settling more thickly on the garden now. He did not get up to look. He knew what the garden looked like in this weather, without needing to look at it. White and still and patient, waiting for the light to return and doing its quiet winter work in the meantime. The bulbs were in. She'd seen to the bulbs in October. In the spring, there would be things he had not thought to plant, coming up in arrangements he had not designed, in colours that had made sense to someone and would make sense to him too when he saw them. He was going to have to answer this letter. There were several things in it that required responses. Practical things, questions about arrangements, requests for news of the house. He would attend to those in the morning when his mind was clearer. But there was also the other part, the ribbon, the particular shade she had seen in the shop window and could not stop thinking about. She'd mentioned it in a parenthesis, almost in passing, a small thing inserted between a report on her mother's health and a question about whether the delivery from the ironmonger had arrived. And yet she had mentioned it. She'd found room for it in the letter, which meant she'd found room for it in her thinking, which meant it mattered in whatever small and specific way a particular shade of ribbon can matter to a person who notices colour. He should tell her to buy it. He had not said anything of the kind in the letter he had started and abandoned. He would say it in the morning, in the letter he would write then, clearly and without making anything of it. Just a line among the other lines. Get the ribbon. And then he would seal the letter and send it, and think no more about it. And when she came home on Thursday, she might or might not have the ribbon, depending on whether the letter had reached her in time, and either way it would not be a significant event in the life of their marriage. It would be one of hundreds of thousands of small things, unrecorded and unremarkable, that constituted the actual substance of their shared life. But it would be the kind of small thing that accumulates, the kind that becomes, in sufficient quantity and over sufficient time, the specific texture of a particular relationship, the evidence that someone was paying attention at a particular moment, on a particular evening, to something that mattered to someone else. This is what most of the archive of Regency marriage is actually made of. Not the grand gestures, not the dramatic declarations, not the moments that would be adequate material for a novel with a satisfying resolution at 200 pages. The ribbon. The extra cup of tea left on a writing table by someone who had noticed the cup was empty. The brief note tucked beside a small gift on no particular occasion. The household account annotated in a wife's patient hand, marked with small arrows indicating where the quarterly allocation could be stretched a little further this time and why. The way the morning fire was lit before he came downstairs, every morning of his adult married life, because someone had established that this was how morning should go, and had maintained it with a consistency that had simply become the nature of his world. The kettle is on somewhere, in the kitchen of this hour and this house, or the equivalent of it, whatever is warming something for you tonight, whatever is making your particular corner of the evening feel habitable and calm. You do not always know who arranged for it to be warm exactly, or when the habit was established, or how many small decisions accumulated into the fact of it. You simply know that it is. That, it turns out, is rather a lot to know. The candle had burned very low now, the wick floating in a small sea of clear wax, the flame almost horizontal, sustained by what little remained. He watched it for a moment. Then he reached out and gently extinguished it between his fingers, in the way that wastes nothing, and the room became what it had always been without the candle, firelit, orange, fading, and he sat in it quietly, the letter to one side, the night outside, and thought about Thursday. The mornings would come, the fire would be lit, The tea would arrive, she would be home, and the house would be full again, and the breakfast table would be occupied on both sides, and the day would begin in the way that days begin when the people who constitute a household are all in it at once, with a particular quality of noise and presence and life that is entirely ordinary and entirely irreplaceable. He thought he might sleep well tonight. The house was comfortable in its dark. The frost was doing whatever frost does. The kitchen was warm. Her letter was to his left on the desk. He would answer it in the morning. Outside, an owl moved through the trees. Something settled in the eaves. The house breathed, and the night was very long and very quiet, and the man at the desk leaned his head back slowly and closed his eyes. And now it is just you. The room you are in, your room, the one with whatever particular quality of dark and warmth and quiet it has tonight, is the room where all of this settles. All the history we have moved through together, all the letters and the diaries and the quiet negotiations and the keys and the breakfast tables and the settlements signed in solicitors' offices, all of it can rest here, in the room you are in whatever arrangement of blankets and pillows and dim light and fading sound constitutes your evening. You do not need to hold on to any of it particularly firmly. The mind has already taken what it needs. The rest can drift. This is what sleep does with history, with everything that has accumulated over an evening. It does not discard any of it. It simply carries it somewhere quieter, where it will continue its slow work without requiring your attention. The things you learned tonight about the Regency period, about the men who kept diaries, and the women whose keys were the real authority of those houses, about the letters written at inn tables, and the household accounts annotated in patient handwriting, and the long years of parallel lives that sometimes converged into something warmer than either party had expected. All of that has found its place in you already, in whatever way new things find their place. You do not need to review it or retain it, or do anything with it at all. It is simply there now, part of the texture of what you know about people and about marriage, and about the particular way that love, when it existed in that period, existed quietly and without adequate language, and without anyone particularly noticing it until it was gone. The hour is late. You've been here for a while now, moving through these rooms, listening to these voices across the centuries, and the voices have quietened, and the rooms have darkened, and the only light is whatever light you have left on, or no light at all if that is where your evening has arrived, and the breathing has slowed, and the body is doing what bodies do when the day is finished, which is to say it is returning to rest, to the long, unhurried country of sleep, where none of the things that required your attention during the waking hours require it any more. Let the waking hours go. There is a quality that the very late evening has that is different from all the other hours, not just darker, not just quieter, but actually different in its nature, like a different kind of time rather than simply more of the same time. The late hour does not press forward. It sits. It has no particular agenda. It is, in some way that the middle of the day can never manage, simply present, simply here, simply itself, requiring nothing. The Regency household, in its late-night version, had something of this quality too. The fires banked, the servants gone to their rooms, the candles extinguished one by one throughout the house, until only one was left, somewhere, and then that one too went out, and the house was dark, and the night was its own kind of room that everyone inside it inhabited together without knowing it. The men who kept the diaries, in those quiet houses, almost never wrote about the nights. The days were recorded, the estate visits, the dinners, the letters sent and received, the social calendar, the weather, the costs of things, the management of things, all the forward-moving machinery of a life in motion. The nights were not recorded because nothing happened in the nights that needed to be set down. The nights were simply rest, simply the necessary interval between one day and the next, inhabited in the dark by a man and a woman who'd been married for some years, and whose marriage was whatever it was, and who slept in the same room, in the same house, in the same darkness, and whose breathing slowed together, and whose dreaming was their own, private, unrecorded, and entirely inaccessible to anyone who came after them with an archive and a set of questions. This is perhaps the most private thing about them. Not the letters, not the diaries, the nights. You can think about that if you like, or you can let it go. The thinking can be very gentle now, if it is happening at all. The kind of thinking that does not quite know it is thinking. The kind that happens on the border of sleep, where images appear and recede without requiring interpretation, where the mind moves through its material in a different way, softer, less insistent, less concerned with arriving anywhere in particular. The wife's letters, folded in a box in the study, her writing on the outside, his handwriting on the inside of his responses to her, which she had kept. All of it sitting in the dark together, in a house that was full and warm, in years when the marriage was good, or in a house that was quiet and formal, in years when it was not, or in a house that was already a kind of absence, in the years after she was gone. The letters did not change with the quality of the marriage. They were simply there, paper and ink, the accumulated record of what two people had managed to say to each other across years of separation and proximity and everything in between. What they had not managed to say, all of that was there too, in the spaces between the words, in the letters they did not write, in the diary entries that stopped, in the pauses between the sentences that the archive cannot recover, because the archive only keeps what was written down, and what was written down was never quite the whole of it. The whole of it was in the room, at the breakfast table, by the fireplace, left side, in the kitchen that was always warm before anyone else was awake, in the keys that passed from one set of hands to another on the second day of a marriage, without ceremony, because the ceremony had already happened, and now it was time for the actual thing. The actual thing was always quieter than anyone had written it would be. It was always more ordinary, and it was always, more than could be adequately said about it, which is why so many people tried, across all the letters and the diaries and the novels and the poems and the conduct books, and why none of them quite managed, and why the archive remains, for all its extraordinary richness, a record of the edges of things rather than the centre of them. The centre was where the people were, in the rooms, in the dark, in the long nights of a shared life that moved forward without recording itself, because it was too busy being what it was. You are in the room now. Your room, your particular dark, your particular quiet. The sounds of your house, whatever they are, wherever you are tonight, are doing their ordinary work around you, the work that sounds do when nobody is particularly listening to them, which is to say the work of being simply present, simply themselves, the background condition of a life that is going forward in its own way and at its own pace. The breath comes and goes. The body rests. The mind, if it is still moving at all, moves slowly now, through images rather than ideas, through the warm half-light of whatever is becoming a dream, without insistence, without urgency, without needing to arrive anywhere before morning. Morning will come on its own, it always does, and there will be things to attend to then, and the day will assemble itself in its ordinary way, and the hours will move forward in their ordinary way, and none of that requires anything from you tonight. Tonight there is only this, the room, the dark, the breath, the slow and quiet country of sleep, which is always just here, always just at this edge, waiting with the patience of something that has been doing this work for as long as there have been people who needed rest. You are almost there. The houses of the Regency period are mostly still standing. The larger ones, anyway. The smaller ones have been replaced or absorbed, and the great majority of the actual daily life houses, the modest gentry homes where most of this story took place, are gone entirely, pulled down or repurposed, or simply worn away. But some of them remain in the English countryside, in particular villages and particular towns, and they have a quality in the late evening seen from outside, the darkened windows, the stone or the brick or the wattle and daub of their original material, the gardens that have been managed for 200 years by hands that belong to different people now. They have a quality that is not quite age and not quite continuity, but something that partakes of both. The rooms inside them were once full of people. They are full of different people now, or no people, or people who do not know the names of the ones who were there before. The fires in those fireplaces have been lit and let go out and lit again across 2 centuries. The windows have looked out on the same garden in winter, the frost on the paths, the bulbs waiting under the frozen soil for the warmth that will arrive in its own time. Everything that has to be waited for eventually arrives. The spring, the Thursday, the sleep that is coming for you now at the end of this long and quiet evening, as the words grow slower and the images grow softer and the dark grows kind. Let it come. Think of all the people who did not leave a record. The archive of the Regency period, all those letters and diaries and household accounts and settlement documents, all the careful evidence from which we have reconstructed the texture of 200 years ago, is, for all its richness, a record of a very small number of people, people who had the education to write, and the time to write, and the materials to write with, and the position that made their writing worth preserving. People whose descendants kept the papers, or whose estates were sold to institutions that kept the papers, or who happened to be connected to someone of sufficient historical importance that the whole collection was transferred to an archive somewhere and catalogued and made available to the historians who came later. The vast majority of the people who were alive in the Regency period left no written record of themselves at all. They existed. They were born and baptized and married in most cases, and they worked and they ate and they slept and they woke and they went about the business of their days in whatever particular corner of England or Wales or Scotland or Ireland they inhabited, and then they died, and most of what they were and thought and felt died with them, because there was no mechanism for preserving it and no particular reason in the economy of their daily lives to try. They are present in the record only as names in a parish register: first name, surname, date, married on this day, born on this day, buried on this day. 3 lines of ink in a leather-bound book in a church that still stands, or that no longer stands, in a village that has changed entirely or has barely changed at all. Somewhere among all those parish register entries are the marriages of people who loved each other in the specific and ordinary way that the letters and diaries of the gentry document, but who had no letters and no diaries to leave behind. People who sat at their own version of the breakfast table and made their own versions of the quiet accommodation, who read or didn't read, who preferred silence or preferred conversation, who had their own version of the ribbon, their own version of the keys, their own version of the long and unremarkable continuity of a shared life. People who worried during confinements in houses that were smaller and colder and less comfortable than the houses in the letters, and who found their way to something that the era had no word for, or who didn't, and who lived inside the shape of their particular arrangement for as long as they had, and then, like everyone, were gone. All of that is gone, not preserved, not recoverable. The fire is out and the house has been demolished, and the parish register is the only thing left, and the parish register says, "Married on this day." That is everything we have of them. This is not a reason to be sad particularly. It is simply the nature of the record, and the nature of what time does to things that were not designed to be permanent. Most lives are not designed to be permanent. They are designed to be lived in the available time, with whatever warmth and care the people living them can manage, and then they end, and the world continues, and other people occupy the same ground, and live their own versions of the same ordinary and irreplaceable life. What continues is not the individual people. What continues is the pattern, the breakfast table, the fire, the letter written from a distance to the person who is not present, saying something practical, and then saying something else underneath the practical, in the space between the lines. The keys in the keeping of the person who has earned the right to hold them. The account book annotated in careful handwriting that will not be studied by anyone, because there is no one to study it, because the house is gone and the family is gone and the book is gone, and none of that diminishes by 1 degree the care with which it was kept, the morning after morning of attention it represents, the person who sat down with it and ran her finger down the columns and thought, "This is manageable, and this is where we are, and this is what we have to work with." That person existed. She sat in a room and kept accounts. She was cold sometimes, and warm sometimes, and tired most of the time, and occasionally, when everything was working and the house was running well and the children were quiet and the season was cooperating, probably pleased with herself in a way she would not have described as pleased with herself, because the era had limited vocabulary for women who found satisfaction in the exercise of competence. But the satisfaction was real. It was there, in a room we cannot find, in a house that no longer exists, in a year that was 200 years ago. A real person experienced a real satisfaction, and it left no record, and that is fine. That is simply how it was. You can hold all of this very lightly now. There is no need to grip it. The mind, at this hour, does not need to hold anything at all. It can simply be in the room it is in the body it inhabits, in the dark that has settled gently over the evening's end. The history is absorbed. The questions have been asked and partly answered and partly left, as all the good questions are, open and alive at their edges, available to return to in the morning or in some other evening, without urgency. The breath is slower now. The body is heavier in whatever surface it rests on. The particular pleasant weight of a body that has been thinking and listening and imagining for a while, and is now releasing the effort of all that, settling into rest the way a house settles into its night, with small sounds and small shifts and the general deepening of stillness that happens when everything that needs to happen in the day has happened. You have been in many rooms tonight. The solicitor's office where the settlement was signed, in winter in 1813, with 2 family solicitors negotiating in careful language over a sum that would mean something entirely different to the 2 people it was designed to protect. The morning room where the chaperoned courtship visits took place. All those careful, watched, insufficient hours that were supposed to constitute the basis for a lifelong choice. The wedding, which was not a particularly useful account of what marriage would actually be, and which everyone who had been married for more than a year understood was not a particularly useful account of what marriage would actually be, and which happened anyway, because it was the way that marriages began, the bedroom in the inn on the road between two places, where the letter was written after dinner with the fire burning, and the journey still half done, and 3 more days until Thursday. You have been in these rooms, and you do not need to leave them in any particular way. They will remain where they are, as all the places we have visited in imagination remain, not entirely real, not entirely gone, somewhere in the soft middle distance of memory, available when they are wanted and absent when they are not. The night is doing its patient work. The dark is complete now, or nearly complete, or whatever degree of dark is right for where you are and what you need. The air in the room has the particular quality that air acquires in the late hour, still and close, and a little warmer than it was an hour ago, holding the warmth of a day well spent, of a mind that has moved through something and is ready now to rest. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to be. There is no question that needs answering before morning. The world is out there, doing whatever it does in the hours when most of its people are asleep. The frost on the paths, the owl in the trees, the kitchen fire banked for the night, the frost on the window glass that will thaw in the morning when the heat of the house returns to it, the garden waiting under its white covering for the season to turn, which it will, which it always does, which has always been true and will continue to be true long after any of us is here to observe it. The season turns, the mornings come, the fires are lit and the house is wake, and the breakfast tables fill, and the days go forward in their ordinary and irreplaceable way, and somewhere in all of that, in the ordinary machinery of daily life as it has always been and continues to be, is the thing we've been talking about all evening, which is simply the fact of 2 people in a room, over time, building whatever they build in the only world available to them. It is enough. It has always been enough. Your eyes are heavy now. The words are slower. The images, if they are coming at all, are coming without effort, arriving at the edge of awareness and passing through it, gentle and unhurried, the way that thoughts move when the mind is almost finished with its waking work for the day. Let them pass. Let the images come and go, soft and undemanding, and let the breath continue its slow and faithful work, in and out. The oldest rhythm, the one that was there before any of this and will be there after, the one that requires nothing from you except to continue, which it will, which it does, which is perhaps the most reliable thing in the world, the simple, patient, continuing fact of the breath, in the dark, at the end of a long and quiet evening. Rest now. The house is very still, not just quiet, still. The particular quality of stillness that belongs to the deepest part of the night, when the building has settled completely into its sleeping self, and the last sounds of movement have long since ceased, and there is only the barely there voice of the world doing its slow and patient work in the dark. The frost outside, the bare trees, the garden under its white covering, the soil below it beginning, already and without any instruction from anyone, the slow work of preparing for what spring will ask of it, the bulbs she put in, waiting, the paths that will be passable again, when the season turns, when the warmth returns, when Thursday arrives. You are somewhere in this house, in this night, in whatever room has become your particular corner of the evening, or you are in a different house entirely, in a different century, in a room that does not have a fireplace and does not smell of wood smoke, and is kept at a temperature that would have seemed impossible, and slightly miraculous to anyone who lived in 1814. The rooms are different. The night is the same. The need for rest is the same. The particular quality of a mind that has been working all day and has now finally found its way to the edge of something quieter, that is the same too. Let the thinking slow. It is already slowing. You can feel it if you pay attention. The thoughts, arriving with a little more space between them, the effort of following them diminishing, the images that come in their place carrying less weight, less insistence, the soft and unhurried quality of the mind approaching its nightly rest. This is not something you need to do. It is something that is happening. The body knows how to do this. It has always known. The waking work is done and the sleeping work is beginning, and the sleeping work requires nothing from you. It simply happens in the dark, in the warmth, in the particular silence of your particular night. Think, if you think anything at all now, of the simplest things. Not the history, though the history has settled into you and will be there when you need it. Not the questions we asked and partially answered and left open at their edges, though those too will be there, available on some other evening without urgency. Think only of the simplest things, the warmth where you are, the surface beneath you, the breath, in and out, and in again, the oldest and most reliable rhythm, the one that has been doing this work without your assistance for as long as you have been alive and will continue to do it without your assistance for as long as you are, in and out. The fire is completely out now in the room where the man was sitting. The candle is gone. The room is dark, the particular dark of a room that has not been entered for several hours and has no source of light of its own. The letter is on the desk, to the left, where he set it before he closed his eyes. The quill is beside it. The room is cold in the way that rooms are cold when the fire has been out for long enough, a still, deep cold that has settled in evenly from all directions, not uncomfortable from the outside, not uncomfortable at all from where you are. Which is warm, which is the right temperature, which is the temperature of a room being lived in by a person who is going to sleep. He is already asleep, the man who was sitting at the desk. He moved from the chair to the bed at some point in the late hours, in the way that half-sleeping people move, without quite knowing they did it, without recording it in any diary because there was no diary open and no candle lit and no particular reason to write down the simple fact of going to bed. He is asleep now in the large, cool, slightly too quiet room that has a quality of absence when she is not in it, and he is sleeping reasonably well, considering, and he is not thinking about anything at all, which is perhaps the most restful thing that can be said about a person. Thursday will come. It always does. The day that is waited for arrives in the way that waited for days always arrive, in the ordinary morning light, with no particular announcement, with the fire being lit and the tea being prepared, and the day beginning to assemble itself in its usual way, and then the sound of the carriage in the drive, and the quality of the hall changing, and the door, and the house returning to its proper weight. These things will happen in a particular room, in a particular year, with the specific and unrepeatable people who constitute that household, and the ribbon may or may not have arrived, and it will not matter very much either way, because she will be home, and the house will be full, and the mornings will have their shape again. This is what was being waited for. This is what is always being waited for, underneath whatever else seems to be being waited for. The return of the person whose absence has made the house feel slightly less than what it should be, the morning with the right quality to it, the breakfast table occupied on both sides, the day that begins with the particular ease that comes from being in a place where you are supposed to be, with the people who are supposed to be there, in the ordinary and irreplaceable life that is yours. You're in your place now. The right room, the right dark, the right warmth. The people who belong in your world are where they belong, or they are on their way, or they are near enough. The day is over. The evening has given you what evenings give when they are well spent. A mind that has moved through something, a sense of having been somewhere, a feeling that settles in the body as a quiet and specific satisfaction, the kind that does not announce itself but is simply present when you look for it. Look for it if you like, or simply rest without looking. Either is right. There is no wrong way to be at the end of a good evening. The houses of the Regency period, the ones that are still standing, are quiet tonight too. The rooms that once held breakfasts and settlement negotiations and late letters and long confinement nights are holding different things now, or nothing at all, or the quiet of a building that is between its days, resting in the dark the way all old buildings rest, with a kind of accumulated patience, the patience of something that has seen many generations of people move through it, and has no particular opinion about any of them, and will be here after them as it was before them, simply standing, simply a room, simply the particular quality of stone and timber and plaster that constitutes the vessel for whatever life is poured into it. The life that was poured into those rooms was ordinary, specific, full of small negotiations and quiet accommodations and the occasional surprise and the long, unrecorded continuity of daily existence. Full of people who felt things they could not say, and said things that did not quite contain what they felt and managed, despite all of that, to build something, in many cases, that was worth building. Something that held, something that produced, in the long run, a quality of shared life that was specific to those two people, and that no one else could have built in quite that way, because no one else was them. That is what we have been sitting with tonight. Not history in the dramatic sense. History in the ordinary sense. The sense in which history is simply what people did with their time, in the rooms available to them, with the tools available to them, doing their best, most of the time, with what they had. It is a comfortable thing to sit with. More comfortable than the dramatic version, perhaps. More honest, certainly, and more human, and more like the thing that you are also doing, in your own room, in your own way, in your own ordinary and irreplaceable life. If this is the kind of evening you like, this kind of unhurried movement through a world that is not your own, but that turns out to be recognizably human, there are more of them where this one came from. More rooms, more letters, more people doing their best in the rooms available to them, across many different centuries and many different places, with the same basic equipment, a body, a mind, a certain amount of time, and the need for rest at the end of it. You will find them where you found this one, when the evening is right and the questions are asking to be quietly explored. We will be there, for now. For now there is only the breath, and the dark, and the warmth, and the particular quality of a room at the end of a long and gentle evening, holding you the way rooms hold people when they're resting, without effort, without ceremony, simply enclosing the space in which the ordinary miracle of sleep can happen again, as it does, as it always does, as it has always done in every room in every house where a tired person has closed their eyes and let the day release them. The night is at its fullest now, the deep, still, unhurried centre of it, the hours that belong to no one and to everyone, the hours in which the waking world has released its hold, and the sleeping world has accepted everything the waking world set down. the thoughts you arrived with at the beginning of the evening, the questions that moved through you as the hours passed, the images that came, the solicitor's office, the morning room, the breakfast table, the road between two places, the letter, the ribbon, the keys, the fire, the frost on the garden paths. All of it is somewhere in you now, resting in the deep and quiet places where the mind stores the things it has moved through. You do not need to know where, you do not need to retrieve any of it. It will be there when it is wanted, as things stored in the right place always are. In the private correspondence of this period, in the diaries written by candlelight in the late hour, people sometimes noted the quality of the night at its depth, its particular character, the way it felt different from the earlier hours, the way it seemed to belong to a different register of existence altogether. Some of them found it peaceful, some found it lonely. Most found it, in some proportion, both. The loneliness of the late hour and the peace of it coexisting the way that most things coexist in an honest account of what it's actually like to be alive. Both things, at the same time, without contradiction. You are in that hour now, the peaceful and the quiet and the particular goodness of a rest that is genuinely earned by a mind that has been working, and an evening that has been given over to something worth giving an evening to. This is what the evenings are for, the good ones, for moving through something carefully, for arriving somewhere you did not quite know you were going when you set out, for the specific satisfaction of a night spent in the company of people and ideas and the long, slow, irreplaceable human story. You have spent this one well. The breath continues, slow and patient and entirely reliable, in and out, the rhythm underneath all the other rhythms, the one that persists through everything, that was there before thought and will be there after it, that asks nothing and offers everything and has been doing so without any particular acknowledgement for every night of your life until this one. Let it carry you now, the way the tide carries things that have stopped resisting, gently, without urgency, in the direction that things always eventually go when they stop needing to be somewhere else. You're not needed anywhere else tonight. You're exactly where you are. In the room, in the dark, in the warmth, in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a body at rest at the end of a day, at the end of an evening, at the end of all the effort of being awake. The frost works quietly at the window. The trees are still. The garden is waiting. The letter is on the desk. And somewhere, not so far from wherever you are, in a direction you cannot quite name but can almost feel, if you pay attention to the edge of things, Thursday is on its way. Sleep well.